Hey everyone, welcome back to the Daily News Roundup. Ready for a jam-packed show today?
Oh, absolutely. Lots to unpack.
All right, let's jump right in then. With Ukraine, they've struck a deal, a minerals deal with the U.S. A senior Ukrainian official confirmed it to our correspondent.
Yeah, this is huge. Remember all that U.S. aid to Ukraine?
Yeah.
Well, Trump's been pushing for a return on that investment, even talking about wanting hundreds of billions worth of resources.
And Zelensky pushing back, saying they're not selling off Ukraine. Plus, they disagree on how much aid they actually got.
Exactly. So what's in this deal? Well, we're still waiting on the fine print, but it looks like the U.S. is getting access to billions in minerals, lithium, titanium, coal, gas, oil, even uranium. Makes you wonder, right? About U.S. foreign policy. Is this the new norm? Aid for economic benefits.
It does make you think. Okay, speaking U.S. policy, the House just passed that massive spending bill Trump's been pushing.
Yeah, and it was close, 217 to 215. Not all Republicans were on board.
Some wanted deeper cuts, but in the end, it passed along party lines. What's the bottom line on this budget?
Well, it's a mixed bag. You've got 4.5 trillion in tax cuts, which sounds good. But how are they paying for it? Spending cuts elsewhere and possibly a bigger national debt? Plus, there's a big boost for the military and immigration enforcement.
Which will have a ripple effect for sure.
Absolutely.
And of course, Democrats aren't happy, saying it mainly helps the wealthy. We'll see what happens when it goes to the Senate.
Yeah, gonna be some tough negotiations there.
Switching gears now to Myanmar, where an our correspondent investigation uncovered something truly heartbreaking. Villagers selling their kidneys just to survive.
The economic crisis there, after that 2021 military coup, it's pushed people to the brink.
I mean, imagine the desperation to resort to selling an organ.
And it's not just desperation, there's this network of brokers exploiting these people. They forge documents, they arrange illegal organ trading, send people to India for surgery, pretending they're donating to family. And the donors, they only get a tiny fraction of the money. And their health. Who knows the long-term impact? It's a dangerous black market.
Over in South America, Chile was plunged into darkness. Massive power outage.
Yeah, President Boric didn't mince words, called it outrageous. Millions were affected. Homes, businesses, transportation, even the world's biggest copper mine.
Wow.
That's a big deal for the global economy, too, not just Chile.
It shows you, even developed countries, they're vulnerable.
Absolutely. And this one, it stretched from north to south. That's how bad it was.
Now, some truly tragic news from Gaza. At least 6 babies have died in the past 2 weeks because of the freezing temperatures and the lack of proper shelter.
It's heartbreaking, and the healthcare system there is already struggling after that 16-month conflict with Israel.
So, hospitals are overwhelmed with babies suffering from hypothermia and other cold-related illnesses. Plus, so many families are living in damaged or makeshift shelters. No protection from the cold. And then you have the political tensions on top of everything else. Hamas is accusing Israel of blocking aid, while Israel says they're following all humanitarian protocols. It's the babies, the most vulnerable, who are paying the price.
It's a stark reminder that these political conflicts have devastating consequences, especially for innocent children. And it makes you wonder, how long can the ceasefire really last? Especially with these arguments over aid and prisoner releases.
Meanwhile, in Australia, there's a story that's causing a lot of anger. A nurse is facing charges after a video of her surfaced online, apparently bragging about hurting Israeli patients.
Yeah, this video spread like wildfire. People were outraged, officials condemned it. It really shows how these online platforms, they can amplify hate, and then you see the real-world consequences.
So the nurse, Sarah Abulebda, she's facing some pretty serious charges. Threatening violence, using a carriage service to threaten to kill, harassment. But authorities say they haven't found any evidence that any patients were actually harmed.
Still, it's a reminder, right? Our words have power, especially online, and they can have consequences. Where is the line between free speech and hate speech? That's a question we're always grappling with, especially in sensitive areas like healthcare.
And speaking of online platforms and their influence, there's been a shakeup at the White House. They're taking control of the press pool, ending a century-long tradition of journalist-led access.
Wow, that's a big change. For decades, it's been the White House Correspondents Association. They've managed access to the president. Now the White House gets to decide who gets those spots on Air Force One, who gets into the Oval Office.
The White House says it's about opening up access to new media, streaming services, podcasts, that kind of thing. But the WHCA, they're pushing back. They say it gives the White House too much control, could limit transparency.
It's definitely controversial, especially with all the tension we've seen between the White House and some media outlets like the Associated Press. They got banned over that whole Gulf of America thing, remember?
Yeah, so this move, it's raising concerns about press freedom, censorship, that kind of thing.
Absolutely.
From controlling the message to struggling with sales, Tesla's shares took a dive after their European sales figures came out, showing a big drop.
Yeah, almost 50% in January. That's not good, especially since the European electric car market is actually growing.
So what's going on with Tesla?
Well, analysts say there's a few things at play. Competition from Chinese manufacturers like BYD is heating up. Plus, some people think Elon Musk's political views, his closeness to Trump, it might be turning off some buyers.
It's interesting how a CEO's personality, their politics, it can affect the whole company.
Yeah.
Speaking of Musk, there's a petition going around in Canada calling for him to lose his Canadian citizenship. Over 250,000 signatures already.
Yeah, they're accusing him of basically undermining Canada, saying he supports Trump, that he worked illegally in the U.S. back when he was on a student visa. It shows you Musk's actions, they're getting noticed, and not always in a good way.
And there's that whole U.S.-Canada tension, with Trump, the tariffs, even talk of Canada becoming part of the U.S.
Yeah, it's a shift for sure from how close those two countries used to be. We'll see what happens with the election coming up in Canada.
Over in South Africa, a court just threw out claims of a white genocide, called them baseless and clearly imagined. This directly contradicts what Trump and, yes, Elon Musk have been saying.
This case, it was about a wealthy guy who wanted to leave millions to a white supremacist group to spread their message of hate. The court said, no way. The claims of a genocide, they're unfounded. It's all based on racism.
So this ruling, it's a big deal. It pushes back against this narrative that some people, even powerful people, have been pushing. It's a reminder that we need evidence, not just claims, especially when it comes to something as serious as racial violence. Now, to a story that's got people talking about how airlines handle sensitive situations. An Australian couple is demanding an apology from Qatar Airways after a pretty disturbing experience.
They say they were flying from Melbourne to Doha, and the airline put the body of a deceased passenger right next to them for 4 hours.
And they say they weren't offered any other seats, no support, nothing.
Qatar Airways has apologized, said they're reaching out to the passengers who were affected. But it makes you wonder, right, what are their procedures for something like this? It's a tough situation, but they need to show some compassion, some care, especially when people are dealing with something so emotional.
Back to the Ukraine minerals deal, Russia's now getting involved. Putin just offered the U.S. access to rare minerals, even suggested some could come from Russian-occupied parts of Ukraine.
That's Putin, always playing the game, showing off what Russia's got, maybe trying to undercut Ukraine while he's at it.
It's a power move for sure. He's saying, hey, U.S., I can supply you, and oh, by the way, Ukraine, not so much.
It adds another layer to this whole Russia-West thing and to the fight over Ukraine's resources. We got to keep an eye on this one.
Now, amidst all the chaos in Syria, there's a glimmer of hope. The interim president has called for a national dialogue conference, trying to figure out what's next now that Assad's gone.
This is a big moment for Syria, trying to create a new constitution, deal with transitional justice, rebuild the country, the economy, everything.
The interim president, Chirag, he wants to integrate the armed groups into the military. He's talking about unity, a state monopoly on weapons. It's a huge challenge. Syria is so divided.
And there's already controversy. The Kurdish-led forces in the northeast, they weren't invited. So is this really inclusive? Will it actually work for all Syrians? That's the question.
At the UN, the U.S. just sided with Russia in 2 votes, both related to the anniversary of the invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah, and that's not sitting well with some U.S. lawmakers and allies. One vote was on a European resolution condemning the invasion. The U.S. voted against it.
Then they drafted their own resolution calling for an end to the fighting, but no criticism of Russia.
It's a big shift from how the U.S. usually does things. Makes you wonder if the global alliances are changing. World leaders are definitely paying attention.
From global politics to a big legal decision, the Supreme Court just ordered a new trial for Richard Glossip. He's been on death row in Oklahoma for 27 years.
It's a huge win for Glossip. He's always said he's innocent. The court said the prosecution hid evidence that could have helped him, cast doubt on the key witness.
This case has gotten a lot of attention. Even Pope Francis and Kim Kardashian have spoken out in support of Glossip. It raises all these questions about the death penalty, about the justice system, how mistakes can happen, and the consequences can be huge.
What happens next in Oklahoma? Will they actually get it right this time? This story really gets to the heart of our legal system, the search for justice, for truth.
Now, to a story that shows how AI is changing the world of work, DBS, the biggest bank in Singapore, they're cutting thousands of jobs over the next 3 years.
They're bringing in AI, automating things. They are creating some new AI-related jobs, but overall, fewer jobs. It's a worry, isn't it? What happens to the workers as technology takes over?
It's happening everywhere. Automation, AI, it's changing what work looks like. What does the future hold? How do we prepare for these changes?
That's the big question, right?
Yeah.
And it's not going away. We need to think about how to train people for the jobs of tomorrow, make sure everyone benefits from these advances.
On a different note, the situation in Sudan is getting worse,
Yeah.
with the U.S. cutting off aid.
It's having a devastating impact. Something like 80% of emergency food kitchens have closed down. Millions of people are struggling. This is part of Trump's review of foreign aid, you know?
It's a crisis. Aid groups are saying it's a hunger crisis. They're pleading for the U.S. to send aid again.
This aid cut, it's having real consequences. People are suffering. It shows how political decisions can have a huge impact on the most vulnerable people around the world.
In Syria, even though Assad is gone, the Kurdish forces in the northeast, they're still facing danger.
Yeah, Turkey sees them as terrorists. They've been launching airstrikes, hitting their positions, even civilian areas. It's raising concerns about human rights.
So what happens to them now? They were key in fighting ISIS, but their future is uncertain.
It shows you, even when a regime falls, the conflicts, the alliances, they don't just disappear, and the people caught in the middle, they suffer.
And this feeds into the bigger worries that Europe has about how the Trump administration is handling things, foreign policy.
European leaders, they're nervous about Trump getting closer to Russia, and there's talk that the U.S. might not defend Europe anymore like they used to.
Trump wants Europe to spend more on defense. He's been praising Putin. So, yeah, Europe's feeling uneasy about their security.
It's a turning point for the U.S. and Europe. Some people in Europe are saying they need to be more independent, not rely on the U.S. so much. And then there's NATO. What happens to that?
Some awful news out of the Democratic Republic of Congo. Survivors of a jailbreak in Goma, they're talking about horrific things. Rape, fire, neglect by the authorities.
Hundreds died, women, children. It's terrible. Rebels were attacking the city, and it seems the male prisoners, they broke into the women's section. There were widespread assaults.
It's a tragedy, and it exposes how bad the prisons are in Congo, how vulnerable women are in these conflict zones.
Someone needs to be held accountable for this. The authorities have to keep people safe, especially women, especially in times of conflict.
Meanwhile, France is trying to smooth things over between Europe and the U.S. Macron just met with Trump at the White House.
It was a tough job for Macron. He's trying to get everyone on the same page about Russia, while Trump keeps saying Europe needs to do more for its own defense.
It shows you the strain on that relationship, especially with the war in Ukraine going on.
Yeah.
What happens next with the U.S. and Europe? Everyone's watching.
Everyone's going to be watching what comes out of this meeting, and the UK prime ministers are going to Washington soon, too. Will there be any progress? The whole world is watching how these relationships play out.
Now to Nigeria, where the former military ruler Ibrahim Babangida, he's written a book, an autobiography, and it's giving people a look into his time in power, which was pretty controversial.
In the book, he says he regrets canceling those elections in 1993. A lot of people see that as a turning point for Nigeria. He also talks about executing his friend, General Mamanvatsa, who was accused of plotting a coup. Babangida defends his actions, says it was a chaotic time.
It's a fascinating look into Nigeria's past, what led to the country we see today.
He talks about the first coup in Nigeria, about the ethnic tensions that have shaped the country's politics. It's sure to get people talking. It's a reminder that history is complicated, and building a stable country, it's not easy.
And lastly, to Germany, where the far-right AfD party, they've been gaining ground, made big strides in the recent elections.
They got more votes than ever before. They're the second biggest political force now.
And that's a challenge, because since World War II, there's been this understanding that mainstream parties wouldn't work with far-right groups. But that's changing.
People are worried that the AfD's influence is going to grow, especially at the state level, where they might be able to form coalitions, get more power. It's a trend we're seeing in other parts of Europe, too, and it's worrying a lot of people.
And it's a trend we're seeing in other parts of the world, too, not just Europe. This shift toward far-right ideas, it's something we need to pay attention to. What's driving it?
It's complicated, lots of factors. People are worried about the economy, about their jobs, and then there are these social and cultural changes. And on top of that, a lot of people have lost faith in the traditional political systems. It's a big challenge, no easy answers.
Lots to think about, that's for sure. Well, that brings us to the end of our daily news roundup for Tuesday, February 25, 2025. Phew, what a day!
We covered a lot today, didn't we? From politics to economics, humanitarian crises, technology, the world's a busy place.
It is, and staying informed is more important than ever. Thanks for joining us for this whirlwind tour of global events.
We'll be back tomorrow with more news, more analysis, helping you make sense of it all.
Until then, stay curious, stay engaged.